Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here for our Green Drinks event for the month of April. We're so grateful to all of those who have come out in person and those who are joining online. We had, as of a few hours ago, more than 160 people who had registered just for the online portion, and we're grateful for all the folks in person here. Thank you so much to Race Brook Lodge, this beautiful setting, for hosting us, which is enabling us, like all of our Green Drinks events and all of Beat's work, to remain accessible and free to the public, which is a very significant commitment we hold as an organization. My name is Brittany Ebling. I'm the Deputy Director at Berkshire Environmental Action Team, or BEAT. We are based in Pittsfield, but work throughout Berkshire County and region-wide throughout the Northeast and sometimes beyond. Our mission as an organization is to protect the environment for wildlife in support of the natural world that sustains us all. And we do that by providing education and outreach, stewardship, and watchdogging programming to do things like fight pollution, fight for an equitable transition to clean energy, and train the next generation of environmental stewards, among many other activities. As I said, our commitment is to making our events as accessible as possible. Part of that involves making everything by donation only. So we are grateful for your contributions to support events like Green Drinks and other free programming throughout the year. You might have noticed that environmental regulations and legislation and funding are under attack right now. So we feel a real commitment as an organization to doing this work that, since Jane Wynn, who founded BEAT 22 years ago with a group of concerned community members, started doing this work, we maintain the commitments that we have always held, which are organizing in grassroots ways as a community to fight the environmental threats that affect us all and affect all beings. So I am so grateful to introduce our speaker, Rubén, who has traveled a long way to be here with us tonight. I first encountered Rubén's work during a workshop he was presenting at Woven Roots Farm. Shout out to Woven Roots Farm, which does great work. Yes. Rubén was leading a presentation on soil health, helping farmers connect environmental science and the principles of biology to understanding cultivation and real-life practical skills. So he is the Soil Technical Coordinator and Education Director at the Northeast Organic Farming Association branch of Massachusetts, or NOFA, Mass. He is a certified lab technician and studied environmental design at the University of Puerto Rico. And my interactions with Rubén suggest that he has a real passion for linking environmental science to social change and community grassroots education, which is, of course, completely in alignment with the ethos and the values of BEAT. After Rubén's presentation, which will last about 30 minutes, give or take, we will welcome question and answer. We'll hold a question and answer period, and we will have questions both from the in-person audience, and Jane will help us amplify questions that are submitted through those tuning in online. So for anyone who is asking a question during that period, I will pass around this microphone lapel so that those who are tuning in virtually can just kind of go step by step and make sure that everyone is able to hear all of the questions as they're asked. And with that, I am so excited to welcome Rubén.
Thank you. Is there a specific place I should probably stand, or over here? Okay. All right, so I kind of went a little crazy with the slides, and I probably have too many slides for the allotted time for the 30 minutes. So we're gonna try to work through these slides quickly so we can get to the questions, which I think are really at the heart of this conversation here today. Quick overview of what we're going to be doing today. Again, this is just a presentation on the connections between glyphosate and soil health, the importance of understanding its effect in terms of soil health. Again, we're going to turn it back to you all, and let's get started. So real quick, There are some not references and resources that will be provided to you all after this event. With that, there's a timeline, so you can actually look at the timeline of what this glyphosate has been done. We'll also be looking at references used for all of the components of this talk here tonight. Most of the talk will be centered around Dr. Don Huber's work on glyphosate. Please look up Dr. Don Huber. If you can get him here to talk to you about this topic, he is perhaps the expert in this one single topic here. Some people may say that he's an alarmist, but I say that he's just speaking truth. So again, a lot of that work is based on his work, along with other studies as well, which you'll get access to as well. Real quick, glyphosate, used mainly in as weed control, right? As we know it. It's the active ingredient in the herbicide products. Really important to know that, right? The glyphosate itself is one of the active ingredients that are used in Roundup, which makes it very, very difficult. And as to the why, a lot of scientists don't have consensus about their effects on soil health, the effects on human health, the effects on ecology. The reason for that is because it's complicated. Not all glyphosate is formulated the same. For example, there's a ionic surfactant that is added to the glyphosate here in the United States, but it's not added in Europe. So anytime somebody in Europe has a study, are we looking at a study just on the active ingredient of glyphosate, or are we making a study on the formulation of a specific thing, right? And that is one of the issues that we're finding, which is why people say, well, it's not that dangerous, or no, look, it's very dangerous. And we'll get into that in a little bit too. Also important to note, 1964, the Stauffer Chemical Company invented this chemical. It was invented to clean out metal, right? To descale metal. It's an excellent chelator. This is why this was actually created. Its effects, herbicidal effects, were then later on established and found out. And again, its common uses are as a weed killer. It's also used in non-agricultural practices too, also for weed management. This is more like parks and recreation, right? Landscaping as well. And something not very known, it's also used as a desiccant. So there's some agricultural products such as beans, right? Beans are actually commonly sprayed, even though they're not Roundup ready. Let's say garbanzos, right? We love hummus. These are actually sprayed much closer to harvest time, meaning that they probably have a larger concentration of glyphosate, and they're using it to dry it out to make it easier to harvest, right? So another way that's been used. Real quick, again, I just mentioned the, in 1964, it was invented by the Stauffer Company to descale, I think it was descaling pipes for boilers. So we're putting that in our body. Its herbicidal properties were discovered later. And because of that, its widespread of use has been promoted by this glyphosate technology, which essentially is the Roundup ready products, right? The genetically modified products. Obviously, whenever there's a multi-billion industry around this, there's always going to be political issues surrounding this. There's going to be an economic interest because of its obvious use. And again, I made a statement there about the effects of these chemicals in the gut have not systemically been evaluated. All that means is that what I just mentioned, right? That there have been studies out there, but no study has actually taken the active ingredient in the human gut and systematically studied. That's not to say that it's not dangerous. That's not to say that it's still not a problem. It's just to say that scientists need a lot of data. Politicians then need that data in order to make decisions. And so this just goes to show about, the complicated issue of how complex this issue is. Let's now actually talk about the glyphosate functions. We have a diagram here. This schematic that essentially just shows you a tree crop. This is your cash crop, and then you have weeds. This is actually then sprayed onto the weeds, right? And there's a few things that happen with this. Glyphosate itself is a chelator, right? A chelator, all it means is that it's actually binding to metal ions to make them, they complex them to something else, right? Those metal ions are the same minerals that plants need to create all of these different functions. They're used as cofactors to create photosynthesis, to all of the different 100+ functions that plants do are created from these micronutrients. Glyphosate takes those micronutrients, complexes them. Now the plant can't take them, and that's how that's the mode of action, right? In the environment, we spray glyphosate, right? No. Glyphosate is sprayed. And then there's metabolites that form after that, right? Those metabolites are a portion of that degradation, and I'll show you guys a little bit more about that. But again, in this chelation process, what are the three things that are affected? They're the plant growth and immunity of the plants. The microbial activity and diversity is just shot. And then the overall nutrient cycling. Nutrient cycling, and we'll get into that a little bit, is the major way that plants actually get their nutrition. So these are the things that are directly affected with the use of glyphosate. So again, I mentioned it is a strong chelator. It chelates specific minerals. So calcium, magnesium, copper, iron, nickel, zinc. These are all the metals. So every herbicide is a chelator. Glyphosate, on the other hand, is a broad spectrum chelator, meaning that it actually not chelates one mineral, it chelates many minerals, which is why it's so effective. It immobilizes those minerals to prevent all that enzymatic activity from the plants or the enzymatic activity in microbes that carry out these functions. And we'll get into some of the more nuanced residual effects as well. Yeah. All right, let's get some concepts out of the way, actually, because I think for us to talk about glyphosate, I'm going to be presenting you guys with three particular concepts on soil health. Many of you have probably heard of these. Some of these may actually be new. So it's important to actually establish this before we continue. So what I have here is, you probably have seen this before. It's a diagram of the soil food web. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because there are many of these organisms that are found here that are affected by glyphosate. All of these organisms here are essential for the ecology of our soils. If any of this is not in balance, our plants suffer, we suffer. And so the idea is to actually keep all of these guys in balance. And I want to start by just running through the different trophic levels that we see here, right? Trophic just means that there's different levels, and every ecosystem has different levels, right? If you look at a savanna, you'll have your lion at the top and then everything else that the lion consumes, right? It's no different than in the soil. So in the soil, we actually have our primary producers, which are our plants. The plants are controlling everything. Now, it's through the process of photosynthesis that we actually get these plants to send out exudates into the soil. These are all the cookies, the sugars, all the good stuff to attract the microbes. The microbes that are being attracted are primarily bacteria and fungi. Within those, there's actually a lot of different species and forms. And then what you end up having is now this whole food web of one thing eating another. everything in life has a different carbon to nitrogen ratio. And that carbon to even us, right? We have a certain carbon to nitrogen ratio. So if I actually consume something that has a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio, that excess nitrogen is now released. This is called the poop loop. This is called nutrient cycling, right? So let's say a nematode feeds on bacteria. All that excess nitrogen is now going to be in plant available form for the plant to take it up, right? And this goes all the way up the food web. So again, really important. The plant is driving all of these processes. We just got to make sure that everything is here and it's in balance, right? All right. This is probably one of my favorite things to talk about. Last year, I had the opportunity to work with Professor Dr. White from Rutgers University. I presented with him at Acres USA. We talked a little bit about this, and we also did a few other talks here in the state too. The reason why this excites me a lot is because after people know about this, every book about plant physiology needs to be rewritten. And I'll explain why. So rhizophagy, rhizo root, phagy eat, right? So it's the roots that are eating. So we just talked about the plants, how they actually recruit all these microbes through their exudates, right? And also important to note, about 50% of those exudates that the plant creates, and it's a lot of energy, right? The plant takes a lot of energy to make it through photosynthesis, all these biochemical reactions that are happening, they're taking a lot of that energy. 50% of the energy, they send it out through the root systems as root exudates. This is how important it is for them, and they know this, they know how important it is for them to recruit these microbes. Within that 50%, about 30% is actually used to feed the microbes. And so we now have a plant. The plant is actually recruiting all these microbes. Let's say they called out for some bacteria. Through the root meristem of the plant roots, bacteria are attracted and get right in, right? And so back in, I think it was 2010, 2011, a group of researchers in Queensland, Australia, discovered that there were all these little things inside the plant. And they were like, well, what are these things? And what they found, they initially thought they were chloroplasts, but what they found was that they were bacteria inside the plants. So they're like, how did these bacteria get inside the plant? Fast forward to 2019, Rutgers University, Dr. White and his team found out that, well, look, they're actually entering the roots, right? And so once they enter the root, the plant, what it does, it actually stimulates sends this superoxide, which is just a very oxidative chemical, breaks up the cell walls of the microbes, right? So let's say that that microbe was going through that whole poop loop and had all this extra stuff inside of it. It entered the plant. The plant's like, oh, great. I was calling you over because I needed nitrogen. But now that you're in here, I'm going to rip you apart. I'm going to do this thing called cyclosis, where you actually are creating a gradient so that all of that stuff that was inside the microbe gets to all parts of the plant. And once it actually has what it needs, the bacteria start to accumulate in the root hairs, right? These bacteria continue to push until they're pushed outside into the soil. Now, this is the beauty of this. This is the miracle. This is what excites me. The plant then says, wait a second, you came in with cell wall, which I took off of you. You came in with flagella to swim around in the soil. You came with all these parts. Here's all the chemical components that you need to rebuild yourself. Go out into the soil and come back when I actually need you again. This is why it's a cycle. This is actually how plants get their nutrition. This is exciting because chemical companies have told us since the Green Revolution that you need plants are getting their nutrients through their soil profile. That is not true. They need microbes. In fact, Dr. White demonstrated that in order for these root hairs to grow, you need bacteria. Bacteria are the ones creating root hairs. It's not going to happen without bacteria. Try growing something in sterile environment. It's not going to work. You'll get a very sickly, spindly plant with not any of these root hairs. So I wanted to bring this up because this is important for us to understand how glyphosate is. You want to shut the system down? Go ahead and throw some glyphosate in the soil. So this is the reason why I bring this up. Another concept really, really important to talk about. This gentleman, which I'm not going to even attempt to pronounce his last name, was a French scientist from the Ministry of Agriculture in France. And he did a lot of research. And within this research, he found that, again, this green revolution is not what we thought it was. A lot of these herbicides, a lot of these pesticides do contain foods for these microbes as well. And so let's talk about, for example, phosphorus, right? Because there's a phosphate component in glyphosate. By increasing that amount of phosphate, you are feeding some of the pests as well. When you continue to feed the pest, what are you going to need? You're going to need something else to actually try to eradicate that same pest that you're trying to do. So trophobiosis just basically talks about that cycle, right? It's this vicious cycle that you add one thing, and here you go. I'm going to sell you another chemical to treat that other thing that you created. And so this book and this research was published in 1985. It took decades to get translated into English. Unfortunately, Francis died the same year the book was published. But he follows a lot of the work on biodynamics and that type of work too. So please look up this work, and I can also provide that too as a reference if people want to read more about it. Real quick, glyphosate is a microbiocide. It's an antibiotic and actually patented as such. It's an antibiotic, right? Again, so if you wanted to disrupt that rhizophagy cycle, a great antibiotic here for glyphosate. Toxic to earthworms, toxic to the rest of the soil food web. Toxic to mycorrhizae. Mycorrhizae, as we know, is responsible for allocating some of the phosphorus and zinc that's in the soil, also water transport, right? Harms reducing bacteria. Reducing bacteria are those that are actually responsible for, again, that poop loop that we were talking about. You get these microbes that start to mineralize, some minerals in the soil, and then the plant recruits them. Well, guess what? The glyphosate affects those. By doing this, these are beneficial bacteria, beneficial microbes. By decimating these populations, we are selecting for having more pests and pathogens in our soils. These same microbes that are responsible for keeping all of these other microbes at bay are being decimated by the glyphosate. Community function, they all diminish. And let's just keep on going. There's a little bit more about that same thing that I just talked about, how the beneficials are actually, unfortunately, destroyed with glyphosate. Other impacts. So these microbes are also responsible for creating these beautiful rhizosheaths. Rhizosheath is whenever you pick up a plant, right? And you see all these dreadlock-like soil particles, you don't see any white. All you see is dark soil. That's rhizosheathing. And so all that rhizosheathing is doing is making sure that that plant has enough nutrients and water to keep it going, right? Unfortunately, glyphosate removed those nice little those microbes, which then leads to this whole soil degradation, right? Because now we remove these microbes that are responsible for creating structure in the soil. They create glues in the soil to keep things together, to keep things from washing off, to maintain moisture in the soil. And permeability. Now you actually have soils. If you don't have the microbes responsible for this, anytime you have a rain event, too much of rain, right? A flood, well, it's going to wash right off. The same is true for the opposite. If you have a drought, these rhizosheaths protect the plants from droughts. This is for the nerds in the room. So it's a diagram that shows you the different pathways, the different degradation pathways. There's two things that it's important to note. There's degradation and detoxification. Degradation is happening when the microbes, because guess what? These same microbes are going to fight back. It's going to take time, but we are now finding that there are sets of microbes that are going to fight back against this glyphosate. We actually have about now, and not just this, there's actually now we're discovering microbes that can degrade plastics as well, which is a great thing because the microplastic issue is a big issue as well. So anyways, that pathway degradation is you have metabolites, right? The microbes chew on this glyphosate, create a metabolite. That secondary metabolite is actually AMPA. And again, you can follow this diagram later on a little more closely. However, it's important to note that that AMPA is 1.5 times more toxic than glyphosate itself. What we want to get to a point is to get to that final stage of degradation. The products sometimes that these microbes are creating do end up being a little more harmful. But that is unfortunately our goal because after the AMPA, we can get other degradation products from that as well. This just talks a little bit about that as well. The different pathways, the enzymes that are actually responsible for this as well. Persistence and breakdown. There's a lot that goes into this. And again, we're speaking of glyphosate and we're speaking of its metabolites as well, but they all have different half-lives in the soil. It all depends on the type of soil. Luckily for us here, we don't have high clay soils. Clay is a really strong, has a lot of cation exchange capacity, right? Meaning that it can actually attract a lot of these cations, which are those same cations that glyphosate is actually after. Unfortunately, phosphorus, again, competes for the same sites. And so if you are doing any degradation processes, add phosphorus, phosphorus can actually then desorb that from the soil solution and become reactivated again. And we can talk about that in a little bit too. Again, impacts on human health. A lot of the studies have shown that, because of this high water solubility, creatures in nature, it's hard to determine that effect that they have. And therefore, because of its high solubility in water, that bioaccumulation has not been really well studied. And again, it has not been systematically studied. That's not to say that it's not harmful. It's just to say that it's a very complex issue that there's no consensus in the community. Same thing with our own gut as well. Again, no consensus. And if you look up the work from Dr. Huber, there's speculations too that there's additional protein-like chemicals that are being formed in our bodies. I can't speak to this. I don't know the research, and it's highly debated. But he does claim that a lot of these chronic issues that we are seeing in society are perhaps responsible for the amounts of glyphosate that we have in our bodies too. Because again, if this glyphosate, it's in our body, it's chelating those minerals that we also need for, I don't know, life, right? And so if you have this glyphosate in your body, it's going to chelate those minerals. You're not going to be able to absorb those minerals. And so we will be in this eternal, perpetual state of hunger, right? Just hunger. It's not all doom and gloom. Again, we have there's ways to get around this. I think that one of the few things that we do need to be concentrating are some of the scientific guidelines that, like we talked about earlier. It's important for policy to actually have concrete evidence, strong evidence as well. I do not support the use of glyphosate. However, I mean, we probably can fight City Hall, right? But short of banning this product, we're going to have to live with how people are using this. And so, again, I feel like it's heresy to even say this, but there are responsible ways to do this as long as you understand what glyphosate is. As long as you understand some of the properties, what it's doing, there are responsible ways. So if we actually talk to politicians, if we talk to folks that are wanting to use glyphosate, worst case scenario, there are better ways. And in fact, there's actually a good way to reduce the dosage by half. And if they are going to be using any glyphosate, you need to come back with a microbial treatment afterwards as well to make sure that you are detoxifying the soil from the damages and bringing some of these microbes that have been known to actually work well to degrade the product. There's not much in here, so we can actually skip that. Because we're at time anyways, right?
So I will let you call on anyone who has questions, Ruben, and I'll come around with the microphone for those who are here, and I'll call on Jane sometimes with questions. Should we start with that? Yes. Let me bring this to you.
So the first one on here is earthworms are invasive. How might glyphosate's impact on earthworms influence native/non-native soil community composition? And can you also add in there the difference between earthworms and jumping worms?
That's a loaded question. Yes, actually, North America does not have any native earthworms. Let's start there. So they're all invasive, if you want to categorize them. Either they're European or Asian, depends on, how you want to classify them. And so I don't subscribe to Francis's work on trophobiosis talks a little bit about this, that we unfortunately have the wrong mentality when it comes to approaching these things. We have a mentality of killing, when we don't have any business in trying to kill things, because we just don't know. Jumping worms is a great example. Jumping worms are detrimental to the forest, but so are the European worms. It's just that they're not as aggressive. In fact, I have done some really, really good compost teas out of jumping worm poop. Great compost teas, which I can then confirm under the microscope. We're now seeing other earthworms like the hammerhead earthworm coming in, which is now the new boogeyman on the block. And so we have to be careful how we actually talk about these, how we talk about life. Again, we shouldn't be in the business of trying to eradicate anything. Nature will find its way. Our job is to make sure that we are actually fomenting life. That's our job. As stewards, we're supposed to foment life, not to kill anything. That's let nature find a way to actually do that. But we have to make sure that we're promoting a diversity of these microbes, of these insects, of just life in general. Create habitat. If people are concerned about jumping worms, create more habitat for frogs, create more habitat for the creatures that will then try to consume them. Hammerheads will come in also, and they're already starting to consume other earthworms. So nature is already finding its way to balance itself out. We shouldn't be getting in the way of it. I don't know what the rest of that question said, and I don't even know if I actually answered the question. So I'm sorry.
I think you did well. Okay, do you want another one from online? Is that okay with everybody? Oh.
Make sure you speak into the microphone. So those online.
Oh. Hear me? I mean, you showed a slide, I took a picture of it, of where the nematodes are on the food. You know, there's like 1 million nematodes and they're all around the world and they're in every soil. They're even in Antarctica.
Yes.
So I don't understand why we would just deselect, we would say it doesn't matter about the earthworms because there's plenty of those kinds of organisms in our soil.
Just so I understand your point is that we shouldn't try to eradicate anything because
I was just reacting to the taking the earthworm example and I just wanted to stick up for the nematodes. That's all.
listen, I love nematodes, okay? They're one of my favorites. After the water bear, they're one of my favorites. Yeah, we don't know anything. Anybody that even myself, actually, I'm standing here in front of you all, and I have to respectfully say I'm not an expert. I don't believe in experts. We're trying to find our way through all of this. We're trying to navigate through the mess that we have inherited. And the best that we can do is just really be humble about all of this and understand that we don't know anything. And again, our best course of action is to foment that life. That's the best that we can do. And yeah, I agree. Go nematodes.
Another one from on Zoom. Is there a difference in terms of the scale collateral damage caused by glyphosate application between large scale spraying, like along a railroad line, and micro scale using the chemical, but maybe drop on a cut stem?
Wow, I hate to answer this with a depends, but it really depends, right? We talked about this earlier. There's not a million. There's many formulations of glyphosate, and then there's dosage as well, right? And even if you actually are doing targeted applications, what are the soil conditions, right? Is it a sandy soil? Back to the point earlier that I said about the clay, right? If you have 30% clay content, guess what? Glyphosate is a forever chemical in your soil if you have 30% clay content. And so it really depends on all of those conditions there. I would say that yes, by large scale spraying, those droplets are getting dispersed more. They're on the surfaces more. The wind can take them to other places. And so, yeah, I would say that logically, generally speaking, yes, large scale spraying is probably more harmful than targeted. But again, humic acid and fulvic acid are very easy things to incorporate, and also adjusting pH and other things too, which I can give you guys. That will be a part of one of those resources on how to properly use this stuff if you have to.
Could you say something about the regulatory process? Because I'm wondering when glyphosate resistant technology came along, did that necessitate any new regulatory action? Because I imagine the original standards must have set some limits on how much you were administering. And as soon as glyphosate resistant technology came along, everybody started administering it in greater amounts. And I'm just wondering if the regulatory process reacts to that.
Yeah, the regulatory process on glyphosate has been kind of scary. And the reason for that is because number one, there were no studies allowed for glyphosate for many years. It was just not allowed. And so based on that premise that a lot of studies were not allowed, and politicians and policy, were using, and regulators were using available data that was created by the person that created the chemical itself. Um, Starting by that premise is an issue already. And then you further perpetuate that issue by what I just described earlier, which is there's different formulations of such. And so, yeah, I don't know. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. But starting with that premise, I would say that it's a complicated thing to even like grasp because again, they didn't allow any studies, and then they allowed studies, but then the studies are all on different formulations. So what should be the right amount and dosage? And it's not the same here as in Europe. There's actually in some of the emails that did surface, there were some scientists out in Europe saying, why are you guys using POE when we actually have something that is not that dangerous? I mean, and that by that premise alone, people, when this reached courts, that's what the jurors were actually latching onto, because there's a scientist out there saying, why are we using this when there's other alternatives? And the folks out here in the US could not answer that. So, yeah.
Hi, thank you. I have a question. It's a little bit more about soil health, but
Okay.
some of the farmers that I work with use glyphosate. They also use petro-based fertilizers. So I think I asked this question maybe at a NOFA conference, but I'm curious if now that we know that microbes are needed for a healthy plant, and they are maybe not accessing the nutrition of a petro fertilizer the same way. So I guess I'm wondering about the way that microbes are able to either deliver organic matter nutrition versus, synthetic fertilizer nutrition.
So the question is, is the question comparing it to a system where they're being sprayed versus not sprayed, or in an environment where they're sprayed with these
I guess that's
high salt, salt-based fertilizers. So the question is, how are the microbes functioning in those systems?
maybe both. If you could answer
Yeah.
without spraying, with spraying.
Yeah. It's that.
Great.
So it's very simple, actually, and is probably what you guys imagine. So those salt-based fertilizers are essentially a shortcut to shortcutting the rhizophagy cycle, right? You are essentially skipping that entire rhizophagy cycle and directly injecting these plants with these salt-based fertilizers. So what you end up is with chemically addicted plants that do not know how to react with their environment. And by doing so, it's the same as actually adding glyphosate. So even salt-based fertilizers is still doing the same damage that glyphosate does, because it's actually then removing all those microbes that are those beneficial microbes responsible for all that nutrient cycling. And so there's other issues with that too. And it's the same issue with the whole degradation of soil, right? You reduce those, you're going to get now more compacted soils. You're now going to get soils that just wash off. In a rain event, you're going to get floods, and there goes your plants. Really, really cool, actually. There was a 15-year study done in Germany called the Jena experiment, in which they actually took different cover crops, and they had different cover crop plots. And so they had this massive flood, and they were like, oh, crap, there goes our experiment. This is it. These plants were underwater. Those plants that were actually that used different species of plants together, once the water receded, no issues, because they actually had all the right microbes in their soil to protect them from that flood even. And so the inverse of that is true as well. If you don't have those microbes there, well, there goes your soil. In a system where those where these high salt fertilizer, salt-based fertilizers are used or not used, you have to first start thinking about the physical properties of your soil, right? Because people often see the soil food web. People often talk about compost teas, extracts, and this biology. Oh, great, great, great. The biology is great. But guess what? If you have compacted soils, biology is not going to do anything. And so the first limiting factor that anybody has when dealing with soils, address the compaction. If you address the compaction, you can then actually work with the biology to actually help promote all of these different things, that nutrient cycling and the structure in your soil and so on and so on. So I hope that answers the question.
Yes.
Okay.
We have a bunch online. Can you explain how glyphosate has more of an impact on beneficial microbes and plants as opposed to non-beneficial?
Yeah. So that's a great question. Let's take, for example, mycorrhizal fungi. Mycorrhizal fungi cannot proliferate in an area where there's too much phosphorus. If you're adding glyphosate to your soil, glyphosate is a phosphate-based chemical. And so now you actually are adding phosphate to your soil, which mycorrhizae cannot proliferate in that soil. And this is the same for any phosphorus, no matter what kind of phosphorus, this is still true. And so you basically inhibited the formation of mycorrhizae fungi because you have too much phosphorus in that soil. So that's just one way. Another way is, let's take the rhizobia, right? So we all know rhizobia. They have nodules in clover and legumes. You break up those nodules, it's nice and red inside. Those are rhizobia, right? It's a whole group of bacteria. They depend on zinc in order to carry out that whole process to fix nitrogen. But guess what? Glyphosate actually then affects zinc because it's chelating zinc. So these nodules and these rhizobia can't perform those processes. So, and parasites or parasitic microbes are opportunistic, and they will thrive in the absence of those beneficials. So those are the methods and modes of action that happen there. It's an excellent question.
One more from the internet before we go back in the room. I've heard that the so-called inert ingredients, surfactants and things like that, can actually be as harmful or more harmful than the glyphosate, especially to things like fish and amphibians. Is that true?
Yeah, that was that graph that we showed earlier about the metabolites. The AMPA, it's actually 1.5 times more dangerous than the glyphosate itself. The POE that we talked about, the scientist in France was talking about, that told the brass out here in the States saying, like, hey, why are you using this when there's something less dangerous to use? That was a polymer ionic surfactant that was being added. So that is true, very true. Which again is why it's so difficult to actually understand the dangers of glyphosate, because it's not just glyphosate.
Hi, thank you. I'm curious, kind of related to an earlier question. I'm curious about microbial resistance to glyphosate, because there's more and more coming out about like plants developing resistance to glyphosate. And I'm wondering if there's any research on microbial resistance and what those mechanisms might be, if they're all detoxification or something else.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of experience with that, but what I do know is that resistance that's coming is because of DNA altering. The mechanism, I believe, is just like the DNA itself. So, for example, there's all these communities of bacteria, fungi, all this life in the soil. There's this constant DNA transfer that's happening constantly, right? Not just with them, but with us as well. There's a component of DNA transfer that's happening. Now, let's say there's one bacterium that depends on another bacteria to carry out a function. But now that DNA has been altered, now the whole system collapses, and you basically end up with a less robust community. About the resistance, I don't know. But if you look at Francis's work on trophobiosis, it kind of hints at that, right? It gets into the more you add this, the more you have to add all these other things because they just don't work because you're disrupting all these processes that are natural processes. And I think that, yeah, Francis's work, I think, actually touches upon that too. But his work was done in the 80s, which we didn't have a ton of experience yet with glyphosate itself, but we had experience with all these pesticides as well.
We have a bunch of questions online about health effects, how glyphosate gets into food products. Does it cause leaky gut, obesity? Can you run with that?
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about that earlier, that some foods like wheat, wheat, beans, can't come up with any other, but those two in particular are cane sugar. Those are all used at the end, very, very close to harvest. And the most dangerous thing are those because they're being sprayed at the closest to harvest from any of these other foods. And so, again, we haven't systematically looked at this whole microbiome thing or our gut microbiome. It hasn't been systematically studied. However, if you speak with Dr. Huber, he will tell you there is all of these chronic illnesses that we're having. He can tell you that they can be tied to glyphosate. And just for reference, he recently wrote a book that was banned here in the United States. That is the book that we need to be looking into. That book actually talks about, and it was actually published in Africa, and it talks about these things, which our government did not want us to read about. I'll try to find that book actually, because I think it's now, you can find it in some places, but it has to do something with glyphosate and the harm that we're doing to our children.
And did you say that you'll give us some references
Absolutely.
that we can send out to people?
Absolutely.
Good.
Yeah.
That's also been asked on
Yep.
here as well.
Yep.
Another question in the room?
Thank you for your presentation. And amid all the complexity and uncertainty, I wonder if you could give us some practical steps that we can take away of how to minimize the risk to ourselves, to the system. Should
Yep.
we, not use glyphosate Roundup in our own garden? Can we avoid consuming it by buying organic food? Like I don't see the current administration investing in a lot more research on this. So what do we do in the meantime?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a little complicated too, but organic food, try to consume organic foods. Although I have to say, just because it's organic doesn't mean that there's glyphosate. I mean, there's glyphosate in our body, there's glyphosate drift, there's glyphosate everywhere, right? And for me to say consume organic foods because it's going to be glyphosate free is a fallacy. However, you have less chances of having glyphosate in your food if it's organic, right? obviously having control over your foods too, just knowing where your food is coming from. It's just, that's probably more important than organic versus not. I think that knowing where your food is coming from, knowing that you can actually perhaps talk to the farmer and say, you know, how are you growing? What are you doing? It's probably the most important thing to do. Get tested, you know, avoid fast foods. Those are the obvious, right? Avoid processed foods. Those are always laced with glyphosate. Although I'm wondering how they have now a line of organic Doritos. But you can also, you know, get yourself tested as well, do an assay on your body to see where you are. You would have to do a online search because these things keep on like popping up everywhere, and it's difficult to test glyphosate too. If anybody's doing any testing on glyphosate, stick with that lab. Do not change labs. The reason for this is there's probably about 5 ways to test for a glyphosate, and each one of those requires a process called derivatization, where you have to you have to do this process in order to then put this onto an instrument. And there's all these different instruments that you put it on. And so if you are using a lab, stick with that lab because otherwise you'll get very disparate results. So stick with that lab. Do an assay on your own body, see where you are. I don't promote this, but Don Huber has talked about this. There's a product that you can use for your own body called Cliniptolite. It's similar to azomite, right? Any farmers in the room? Azomite? Zeolite. Anyways, so you can actually use this product to start to chelate some of that glyphosate in your body as well. Again, I haven't used this. I started looking into research as to the uses of that in human, and I use my wife for this since she has access to more medical stuff. And so far, the studies that I've read do not show any harm of using that cliniptolite. So that's a way that if we do have glyphosate in our body, we can start to consume these things to actually start getting rid of it. But then you have to like make sure that, to your point, not using glyphosate, and finding alternatives too, right? So if we're talking about a small scale of use a tarp, use mechanical ways. Don't spray these things, right? I was surprised last year when I found my father-in-law. He's like, I have bamboo in my yard. I'm like, bamboo? So I went over and looked at, you know where I'm going with this. And I looked at the plant. I'm like, no, this is not bamboo. This is actually monkeyweed or Japanese knotweed, you know. But you couldn't tell that this plant was in his yard because he's obsessive. And anytime it pops up, and he's like, oh yeah, you should have seen when I first moved in here, this bamboo was everywhere. He did not spray it at all. He just obsessively weakened it. And so mechanical ways do work, but no municipality, no government wants to hear that because it's too expensive. It requires too much manpower. And we don't go for those things, but there are alternatives out there as well. You know, for small scale too, you can tarp things, you can actually oculate so that the sun doesn't hit these things and you can just eliminate your weeds that way. The other thing that I'm going to say about your weeds, eat them. Just eat them. They're medicinal. Find those weeds, eat them, make coffee out of it, make fermented plant juice out of it, which you can then spray onto your plants. You know, and humans are actually really good at eradicating things and overfishing or overgrazing. So we should probably be doing that with some of these weeds and finding some of their medicinal properties. You know, I don't understand this fight that we have. When I see weeds in the environment, they're speaking to us. They are saying things to us. And you can read a landscape and say, oh, there's that weed growing there. There's compaction over there. Let's alleviate that compaction And those weeds are out of a job now because they were there because the soil was compacted. They're just trying to fix things in the soil. And if we just stopped for a second, listened, paid attention, and stopped reacting to things and start killing, this killing mentality, we would go a long way. Those would be a few things that I can think of off the top of my head of alternatives that you can do.
I think that's a perfect note to end on, seeing as we're at 7. So thank you so much.